Greetings, fellow watch enthusiasts. This is Tobias from Watches in the Wild, where we showcase watches not in artificially lit rooms, but in the wild where they belong. Today we are in for a treat. I will compare two super interesting watches across 5 categories. So let's go! Grand Seiko versus Tudor. Let's dive right into it. Not into the Rheinfall, of course, although it will serve as a backdrop today, but into our first category, the proportions. There is no two ways about it. The Tudor wears large, lug to lug. It also sits remarkably tall. Frankly, I'd consider its proportions overpowering for a regular watch. But keeping in mind that we are talking about a professional diver ambitiously engineered to operate at 500 meters underwater, it does have a license to be bigger, and its sin of claiming effectively all of my wrist shall be forgiven. Thanks to its matte black dial, it appears smaller than it would in a light color. Bright areas have the effect of scattering light inside the eye, enlarging the surface on the retina. It is this optical illusion, or rather the lack thereof, which makes manageable what in a lighter color would seem to overpower my wrist. Given its nature as an uber-capable dive watch, the Tudor deserves a passing grade in the size department. Now on to the GS. While being a smaller watch overall, it more than makes its presence known and sits remarkably proud for what I would call a sporty dress watch. Much like the Tudor and much unlike traditional dress watches, it challenges the limits of my wrist, proudly spanning almost all of it. Knowing that the spring drive movement can be housed in cases as small as 39mm, this seems like a concession to current trends and is unfortunate to say the least. The Grand Seiko wouldn't have suffered from a little shrinkage, especially considering that it is geared towards the Chinese market, where so-called small wrists are much more common. There are two redeeming aspects to the watch, however. First, its lugs bend downward in decisive fashion, wrapping around the wrist much better than the Pelagos does. Second, its center of gravity is low, making the large watch sit closer to the wrist and the wearing experience a joy. All in all, let's give the GS a passing grade, but only just. And next, let's talk about the case. If you look at it, we are struck by a contrast which couldn't be any more obvious. The Tudor features an industrial matte finish with a minimal amount of polishing on its flanks and surprisingly sharp edges delineating the different surfaces. It is well done and perfectly in line with a no-nonsense toolwatch aesthetic. If the term toolwatch means anything, it means that it should be ready for the adversities of everyday life. Naturally, this means attracting the odd scratch here and there, and scratches simply don't stand out as much on non-polished surfaces. Far from being an eyesore, I happen to think that they actually enhance the look of my Tudor. They make it appear like a storied object and remind me of the adventures I had with it. Last but not least, due to its lightweight titanium construction, the watch wears extremely comfortably. Beyond that, it even has a certain historical significance, as this is the first full titanium watch to come from the house of Rolex. And what was first once will forever be first. Looking at the GS, there is no mistaking it for a tool of any kind. It is as much a tool as an actress showing off her dress, and perfect makeup could be confused with a guy from a construction site. The eye is treated to an abundance of highly polished surfaces. It is amazing to see that even the inside and underside of the case was lavish with Grand Seiko Saratsu polishing. I can't help but be reminded of Gothic sculptures who made sure that every detail of their statues got finished to perfection, even the parts which nobody would take a look at. Though not Grand Seiko's most elaborate case shape, it is by no means simple. Rather than being strictly vertical, and this is hard to capture on camera, it gently slopes downward, making the task of finishing it all the more challenging. The fact that we are talking about a hand-finished case as opposed to Tudor's machine polish deserves to be highlighted. Knowing that an actual human took the time and care to finish it makes it exude a warmth and poetic charm which the Tudor is simply lacking. The only downside to this kind of polish is the many scratches it will inevitably attract. Scratches which will be as obvious as a pimple on the nose of a supermodel. Nevertheless, and if only for its sheer ambition, I have to give GS the full score in this category. The Tudor doesn't even come close, to be honest. Arguably the most important part of a watch is its face. After all, that's what we spend the majority of our time looking at. GS and Tudor follow two very different design strategies, but they overlap in one major aspect. Let's start with the ugly duckling of the two. Clearly form follows function here, with the black and white color scheme being somewhat austere but eminently useful. Thanks to the contrast it creates, even I can read it from a distance, and some would say I'm almost blind. The hour markers are unadorned, just a piece of loom with no fancy frame around it. Likewise, hour, minute and seconds hand are mostly just luminous material. And frankly, that's enough. What more do you need to read the time? While the snowflake hour marker is considered ugly by some, it being big and bold fits the overall aesthetic perfectly. The bezel is remarkable in its utilitarian nature as well. It is, of course, non-glossy and thus worlds apart from its older brother, the oh-so-shiny Submariner. Rather rare for dive watches, it is filled with luminous material, making the ceramic bezel readable by day and by night. In conclusion, the design of the watch face and bezel aligns beautifully with the purpose-built nature of this watch, even though it itself isn't beautiful at all. I value consistency above everything, and that's why the Pelagos receives a full score from me. Switching to the GS, we are presented with another beast entirely, or rather, the beautiful counterpart to the beast we just examined. Just look at this style. Look at it some more, and then look away. Now, be honest, can you tell me which time it showed? If you can, your aesthetic preferences might differ from mine. More often than not, I just stare at it, forgetting completely what I was up to. From the smooth gliding of its second hand to the diamond-like polish of its sculpted hour markers, it is what the English call an embarrassment of riches, almost too beautiful for its own good. And I haven't yet mentioned the neatly carved cloud pattern forming a soft blue backdrop to all of this. Nevertheless, and this is perhaps surprising, behind this surface hides a practical watch, one that is perfectly able to tell the time and does so in a clear and precise fashion, if your attention isn't getting captured by the visual fireworks, that is. Every minute between the 5-minute intervals is indicated by a black marker, even the ones at 3 o'clock near the date window, a notable example of function over form. And there is even a power reserve indicator to remind you when it is time to wind the watch again, a feature that can come in handy when you haven't worn it in a while. Last but not least, if you cross-compare the size of the date, you will see that its numbers are markedly bigger and thus easier to read on the GS. In short, both watches are practical, but the GS goes above and beyond practicality and enters a realm all of its own. The bracelet is an integral part of the watch and contributes significantly to the feeling of wearing it. With that in mind, let's compare the two on this basis. The Pelagos stays true to its tool-like character and offers a brushed-only titanium bracelet. Its quote-unquote extra feature is a slight tapering of the bracelet, giving it a more sleek and elegant look. The individual links are solid and held together by screws. Even after 5 years of use, the bracelet still inspires confidence and, importantly, it shows no or little bracelet stretch. Over the years, it has collected more than a few battle scars. Needless to say, I have to blame myself for that, bumping it into countless doors, cars and tables. But it also has to do with the titanium being used. It is grade 2 and not the higher quality grade 5. The latter would have been stronger and more resistant to scratches. It is disappointing that Tudor refused to go the extra mile here. All is compensated by the clasp, however, which has to be the highlight of this bracelet. For starters, it allows for a full-out dive extension with the idea of fitting it over a wetsuit. Now, of course, nobody needs that, but it is there nevertheless and adds to the tool-like character of the watch. More importantly, the clasp can be micro-adjusted in 4 positions, with the 4th position adjusting the bracelet automatically, depending on the expansion or contraction of the wrist. Add to that the ceramic pin snaps, which make closing and opening the clasp a reassuring joy and make sure that tolerances are maintained for longer. All in all, I consider the bracelet a home run and have to give it a near perfect score. The bracelet of the GS is, unfortunately, a whole other story. Nobody can deny that it looks good. Yes, it does. However, its close resemblance to the Omega Speedmaster has to be mentioned, which raises the suspicion that its design wasn't entirely original. Having said that, GS features a fine beveling running along the outer links, attention to detail which has all but vanished from the bracelets of other players. One has to appreciate that and admit that the look is indeed refined. But the steel bracelet doesn't deliver when it comes to a more important aspect, how it feels to handle and wear it. While it doesn't give off the impression of falling off every moment, it seems just a bit flimsy and inspires little confidence as to its long-term viability. On top of that, it makes a squeaky sound now and again, comparable perhaps to the noises of a rusty door when pushed open after a long time. It is quite simply impossible to associate with a luxury product. The clasp, I'm afraid, is lackluster too, simply because it doesn't provide any micro-adjustment. One has to find a perfect fit for all temperature conditions right away. At least the links are held together by screws, which makes sizing and resizing the bracelet an easier undertaking. But it is still just that, an undertaking. In conclusion, I can't help but feel that GS did underperform in this category. The quality of the bracelet simply isn't up to par with the quality of the watch. I'd have to give them a failing grade and declare Tudor the clear winner in this category. A watch, much like a human, is more than meets the eye, so let's take a look at the all-important inside and compare the movements of these two watches. The Tudor houses the ETA 2824 inside, a movement entirely without bells and whistles. It's as humble as a mechanical movement gets, but has proven its reliability over decades of use by a myriad of different manufacturers. Now, some will criticize the lack of an in-house movement. If you are one of them, let me just point you to the new iterations of this watch. I personally don't take issue with the ETA being on board here and, in some way, even prefer the off-the-shelf movement. There is a reason it has been around for decades. It keeps accurate time, would probably survive a nuclear blast, and is easily serviceable by any watchmaker. You're not just stuck with Tudor. I also like that it has been beating away in many older references, which links the Pelagos to some of its predecessors and provides a sense of historical continuity. Having said that, and to make at least one concession to the in-house crowd, I wish its power reserve was higher. Being able to take the watch off for the weekend and pick it up again on Monday without having to wind it would be convenient. 38 hours is scarcely enough if you don't want to wear the watch all the time. That's about the only gripe I have with this movement. It is far inferior to Grand Seiko's offering, and it surely wouldn't suit a fancy dress watch, but it suits this watch perfectly. Moving on to the GS and its spring drive caliber, it's hard to overstate the difference in the degree of sophistication. If in the Tudor we just encountered a Neanderthal chasing down a deer with a bone tool, we are now witnessing a gentleman in a three-piece suit pouring himself a bourbon. Not only is the spring drive made in-house, it is a movement exclusive to Grand Seiko and really sets itself apart from all other movements mundanely toiling away in other watches. With a time deviation of under a second per day, it is both almost as accurate as a quartz watch and powered through a gear train just like a mechanical watch. We are talking about a seamless integration of mechanical and electronic parts, a vision that took Grand Seiko 28 years and countless prototypes to materialize. Since Grand Seiko produces both mechanical and quartz watches, marrying the two makes sense and could be considered a culmination of all their previous efforts in timekeeping. The fact that a spring drive movement is powering this watch can be gleaned from the dial alone, where the second hand glides oh so smoothly across the dial. A perfectly seamless motion that no other watch offers. The only objective criticism I can find is the winding action of the crown, which offers quite a bit of resistance. And of course there is that bloody lion logo blocking the view of the movement. Last but not least, let's discuss what doesn't fit into any neatly defined category, but often dictates much more how we feel about the watch than a case diameter or a color choice would. I'm talking about that X factor, which is hard to put into words. Both watches score here. The Tudor does so with its distinct identity as a purpose-built tool watch, an identity that we see reflected in every design aspect, be that the lume-only hour markers or the solidity and adaptability of its bracelet. It all works together to form a coherent whole. On the other hand, we have the Grand Seiko with its surpassing beauty. Then, of course, there's the exclusivity aspect. GS has limited this sample to only 181 pieces. Having something on the wrist that you are unlikely to encounter on any other naturally raises its desirability, at least for us humans who always lust after the thing that nobody else can get. All in all, there is no denying that the GS feels like a more special watch, because it is a more special watch. Which one would I declare the winner of the two? Even though there is hardly any objective basis for it, I would have to go with the Tudor. It doesn't attempt to charm anybody and is charming for that very reason. It may not win over my head, but it has certainly captured my heart. This is my final verdict, but which of the two do you prefer? Leave a comment down below and let me know.